This is your World War III update. Canadians, Americans, Europeans, you need to get ready for a military draft. At the time of making this video, the Department of War has officially announced the commencement of Operation Southern Spear to go to war with Venezuela. In Kiev, the parts of the city that are not blacked out by Russian attacks on the power grid are in flames after being bombarded by drones and missiles. Russia isn't faring too well at this hour as well. In Novorossiysk, in Crimea, around the Black Sea, a massive port was destroyed, as well as an oil depot that was struck, and several air defense installations, possibly S-400, S-300 installations. The war is ratcheting up only a day after the Epstein blackmail racket reared its ugly head again, so we know that Donald Trump is going to give an a la carte blank check to the military-industrial complex in the coming days, and you're going to see him exonerated in the court of public opinion when the emails or the files or whatever they decide to release is heavily redacted and removes any doubt that he is guilty of any wrongdoing. That's the whole play here. That's the setup. Hold his feet to the fire to make sure that he's going to comply, because they know the market is going to crash. And when the market crashes, and when you are in such austere, destitute conditions that you have no other choice, that's when you are going to probably want to volunteer for military service. And if you choose not to volunteer, then it is going to be an involuntary lottery-like conscription like they're setting up in Germany. Now, today, I want to talk about what SHTF is going to be like. I'm not sure which channel I'm going to upload this on. It's kind of a Canadian prepper video, but it's also kind of a prepper news in a way, because Canadian prepper and the prepper news converge during disasters, okay? And there's two general types of violence in an SHTF scenario. One which is centralized and one which is decentralized. One in which the government has a monopoly on force, where they essentially become despotic and all malevolence is top down. And then you have the Mad Max situation, which is different in that it is more distributed violence. There is no centralized government control in that situation. If there is a government, they're holed up trying to ensure their own continuity of existence. So you have centralized, which is like dystopia, and then you have decentralized forms of criminality and SHTF, which is Mad Max. In prepper terminology, we call the dystopian, despotic view, that's like an excessive rule of law. The Mad Max is called the without rule of law, WROL, as it was called. I think James Wesley Rawls coined that term. Now, there's also a hybrid form, which usually happens before SHTF, and that is what we have here in Canada, and it's anarchy, and it's also tyranny. In fact, there's a catchy name for it. It's anarcho-tyranny. In this environment, you create an environment of criminality that the government uses to justify giving itself more powers while depriving law-abiding citizens of their rights and privileges. So the lack of rule of law element, the criminality element, is used to justify more government controls. Here in Canada, they're slowly priming us for all of this. They're confiscating the firearms, they're invoking emergency powers whenever it's convenient, freezing bank accounts, slaughtering rare exotic species of birds when there is no scientific reason to do so. Of course, they're going to tax half your paycheck. They're going to regulate your access to media. They're probably going to outlaw gold and precious metals. They're going to expropriate your property under the guise of reconciliation. And, it goes on and on. So don't think for a second that military conscription is beyond the pale here, okay? It is the greatest of evils, military conscription, because you're essentially condemning someone to die in a war. You're taking their life. You're taking everything. It's one thing to take a person's land, to seize their assets, to make it so that whatever sort of CBDC they roll out, that they turn off, or limit your internet access, or control information and work to misinform you. It's another thing altogether to deprive you completely of your rights and freedoms, and either put you in jail if you refuse to comply, or send you to the front lines. Now, you guys are probably saying, like, what the hell are you talking about? Conscription, okay? So the Canadian Armed Forces right now, they're hard up for recruits. And I can tell you this, the wet dream of any despot, of any leadership, is the military draft, is conscription. Now, it's going to start off as some kind of offshoot of civil service. Then it's going to turn into a reservist sort of thing where you're going to be conscripted, but you're not necessarily going to fight a war. And some people might even approve of this. In fact, there's been many, I think Jesse Ventura was a big advocate for the military draft for a multitude of reasons, that it instilled certain values and patriotic sentiments into people, and maybe even taught them some basic survival skills, okay? And so this is how they're probably going to try to sell it. But because the big war with Russia and China and all of the axis of evil is currently brewing, well, they're going to need to have an army to fight this, and we are in no condition to fight. We are too, caught up in doom scrolling and hedonism and brain rot of all various forms, and process addictions, and you name it. We are mentally preoccupied with things which are counterproductive to having a standing army. So right now, the Canadian Armed Forces is embarking on a surge to produce a supplementary reserve of 300,000 by tapping civil servants in both provincial and federal governments. So what this is going to involve is getting all of the bureaucratic underlings trained in how to use firearms. I know it sounds crazy. Could you imagine, like, social workers and people who've never fired a gun in their lives, trained in these sort of things? Truck driving, learning how to fly drones, learning how to do things that emergency services would do. They're going to loosen standards on age and fitness, and they might even raise the reservist age, the conscription age, to 65. Okay? So in Ukraine, you've probably seen video, not only in Russia, but also in Ukraine, of guys who are in their 50s and 60s conscripted on the front line. Because as war has evolved, and as they just basically need people to sit there and draw the fire of these drones, they don't expect them to do a lot of running and gunning per se, even though there is a lot of that. But it seems as though they just want pawns to be used in meat waves. Well, they're using older people, and we're an aging population. So if they're raising the age of retirement, they're also going to raise the age of military conscription. Right now, the supplementary reserve is around 4,400 people for a country of 40 million. Okay, they want to raise that to 300,000, which is still rather paltry when you consider the scope and scale and just the sheer geographical magnitude of our country as it is. And then they want a primary reserve boost of 24,000 to 100,000. All right. A Tiger team at the Department of National Defense is building a defense mobilization plan here in Canada, including required legislative changes, although no timeline has been given on when this is going to be rolled out. But it will be what they're calling a whole of society push to lead national servant culture engagement. The Department of National Defense says this is about national resilience for crisis, disasters, and defense. And they're consulting places like Finland for guidance on how to implement such a program. They're saying that the threat of war with China and Russia are part of the reasons as to why they're pushing ahead with this. So, if you think we're going to be given a pass Understand what they're doing in Ukraine is a trial run for what is going to happen in Canada. People need to realize this. The problem is our police and our constabularies are far more militarized. In the States, they're walking around with semi-autos, okay, and face masks. They're already that far into it. Now, you might say, well, that's for ICE, that's for non-citizens. It's getting you used to seeing that. It's getting you accustomed to seeing a guy dragged out of a car, right? And now, it may come to the point where they're no longer dragging illegal immigrants out of a car, but because you don't know if it is or not, you're just going to assume it is. And just like they do in Ukraine, they wear masks, okay? These guys are wearing masks. They jump out of the white van. Sometimes they're in military fatigues. Sometimes they're in police uniforms. They're never armed. That's the thing. These guys are never armed when they do this. That's the difference. You see, here in the West, in the Wild West, in Canada and the United States, our cops are heavily armed, and they will absolutely just follow orders. I mean, we've seen that with the ostrich thing, where in the dead of night, they got some guy with an AR-15. Apparently, he used an AR-15, which is something they say there's no need for here. I guess the only people who need AR-15s are governments who want to mass slaughter exotic birds when there's no demonstrable scientific reason that they need to do that. Anyways, so if you don't think that they're going to do that to us, okay, if you don't think that they're not going to follow orders when it comes to putting you down, and just imagine what's going on in Ukraine, where their style of, forced military participation, imagine that here where the guys are armed. So you can imagine what it's going to look like, where we're so used to watching people tased or shot, and sometimes it's justified, a lot of times it isn't, right? Because we're pussies here. And yeah, at least in places in Europe, they're still not afraid to use the billy club and get a little physical. You know what I mean? People think it's normal for cops to carry around like semi-automatic weapons and, drive around in these MRAP type vehicles. I mean, that's not normal, So we've been conditioned to believe all that. But when that is actually turned against us, and this is the problem with the global geopolitical instability and wars abroad, is that as those wars intensify and as the global economic crisis, I'm talking about the real crisis now, all right? When this bubble pops, that's when they're going to turn the guns inwards, because the only way they can fight the war out there is if they first declare war on their own population. Canada is taking its own approach through anarcho-tyranny, and the Americans are taking their own approach. Here, they're trying to declaw and defang us as much as they possibly can so that we're well neutered and ready to be sent to slaughter when the time comes in the United States. They afford you guys a few more rights and freedoms, but they make sure that they are more armed and they are walking around with semi-autos, and they already got you used to that, or automatics, I should say, and that they have bigger fangs and bigger claws than you. I want to show you, I know I'm jumping around a lot, but I want to show you this. This is the only two graphs you need to know for what's about to happen in the financial system. Okay, so this is a graph that shows you the amount of consumer exposure to the stock market. And you can see it has just spiked up in the last few years. Okay, this is the bubble. This is the AI bubble, all right? The highest median exposure to stock market, and a lot of this is 401ks and things of that nature. Now, take a look at this. This is Warren Buffett's cash stockpile. The guy who at one point was the richest man in the world, made all of his wealth through investing, unlike a lot of other guys who make their wealth through running companies. Warren Buffett, also known as the Oracle of Omaha. Now take a look at these. Do you notice something similar between these graphs? You could literally overlay it, and it would overlay almost perfectly on top of that. What is this telling you? This is irrational exuberance. This is rationality. This will win. this will lose. It always does. When that happens, people are going to be so destitute that they're going to be open to money printing, but many of them are also going to be open to the prospect of getting your 3 hots and a cot with the military. Now, on the topic of that, and this is how it all ties together, I was reading a tweet the other day by an account called Animal Justice, and it really got me thinking about how governments cleverly move the goalposts in order to meet their totalitarian ends. Get a load of what Animal Justice says and see if you can figure out the problem with what they're saying as I read it to you. Animal Justice has filed a legal complaint with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency over cruel methods it used to execute hundreds of ostriches at Universal Ostrich Farms. Shooting animals in the dark in front of their flock mates goes against agency guidelines and likely cause illegal suffering. Can you see the problem with what they're saying? Can you see how they move the goalpost? It's very reminiscent of the Canadian gun buyback program and how they're trying to make the issue not about the confiscation of guns, not about the murder of birds in the first place, but about how that murder or confiscation is conducted. It should be conducted in a humanitarian way. So what they're saying is they accept the illegitimate extrajudicial killing, well, I guess it wasn't because the Supreme Court approved it, of these animals. They're okay with that, but they didn't like how the mass murder was done. And in the same way, they're going to move the goalposts with gun confiscation. They're going to say, you know what? You guys were right. You should be fairly compensated because we're so magnanimous. We're going to make sure that you're well compensated for your firearms. You really think this government gives a rip to spend a couple extra $1 billion to make sure that they can take your only means of defense in this environment of anarcho tyranny, which is approaching its maturity? Of course they won't. They're $71 billion deficit. They'll tack an extra $2 billion to defang you, no problem. And in the same way, when the draft starts, you're going to have all kinds of humanitarians come out of the woodwork. Well, just make sure that you're feeding them nutritious food, and you're going to have people protesting the barracks and the living conditions of troops that have been conscripted, and that's how they move the goalposts. So you can't succumb to these tricks. This is what they're going to do, right? Because they know the people, they know a lot of people don't think this critically. They don't have the time because they're too busy trying to make ends meet. And when it all goes down, in the run-up to SHTF, anarcho-tyranny is where we're at. They want to go into full-blown despotism, centralization, monopoly of force. That happens when World War III begins. And then once the nukes get exchanged, that's when we go into Mad Max, and it's decentralized violence. Now, that decentralized violence is something I'm willing to take my chances with, because quite frankly, nothing should scare you more than government violence, because the government is something you stand no chance of resisting. Ultimately, at the end of the day, some people talk really tough, but that's the biggest organized gang out there, okay? And they have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of foot soldiers when the time finally comes. And there's also a very dark, malevolent, sociopathic angle that emerges with these totalitarian, hyper-centralized forms of tyranny. And it's something that is only really present in the most elite circles. when you have everything in life that you want, when you have everything, when you have all the money that there is to be had, when you can't buy a bigger yacht, when you've already been up in the Blue Origin spaceship, you've flown around in low Earth orbit, you've had every possible experience there is to have, well, essentially you start partaking in human sacrifice and worshiping Satan. I mean, that's really all there is to do, right? At the end of the day, you start engaging in all manner of depravity and debauchery, because if you don't at some point realize the importance of minimalism and spirituality, if you don't go down that path, you go down the path of self-destructive process addictions, and you go to Epstein Island, and you hunt humans, like this article that I just came across that claims that during the Bosnian War, tourists paid $70,000 to shoot innocent people in human safaris, human trips to Sarajevo, with extra money charged to kill children. Now, this is from, I believe this is from the Telegraph. Now, they try to downplay it at the end and say, well, British soldiers who served in and around Sarajevo said they never saw or heard such sniper tourism, and described the idea as an urban myth, citing heavy checkpoints and logistics as major obstacles. That's nothing 100,000 pounds can't figure out, or 100,000 euros in today's terms. There are certain miscreants out there which are just waiting to be unleashed on the population. And in my recent conversation that I did with Aaron Acey, who is somebody who works in disaster zones around the world, humanitarian, has done a lot of human trafficking work, go and watch that video, because he talks about a certain breed of malevolence within North America and certain parts of Europe and probably other first world countries. I think it's a first world problem. He said the biggest consumers of human trafficking are North Americans, like Canadians and people in the United States, because we're engaged in this, hedonic form of conspicuous consumption where, again, if you have everything you need in life, then you just start worshiping Satan and engaging in human sacrifice. And this criminal element will be unleashed, and I mean violently unleashed, on the populace. We're not talking about people who are stealing shoes because they want to look cool. Okay, that's one criminal element, but that's the lowest tier of criminality. We're not talking about people who want drugs. Okay, that's one kind of miscreant, but not the worst kind. We're not talking about people who will rob, cheat, and steal. And there's people who will rob, cheat, steal. We're getting into the realm of the real devilish, depraved individuals that only emerges at that higher level of power and control. And that's the criminal element that you really have to be mindful of in these situations, the sociopaths, right? The ones who maybe have a bit more intelligence as well. And these are going to be a force to be reckoned with, and it's going to be something that we don't have a trial run for. In most of the war zones that Aaron visited, he said that there's a different sort of mentality of the people in those places. But when shit hits the fan, happens here, he said it's going to be different. Okay? Because for a variety of reasons, is it mental health related? Is it because we're just, enamored with brain rot content and video game addictions and pornography and drugs and alcohol and just, all manner of debaucherous distraction, that this is why when you pull the plug on this whole thing and the lights go out, everybody just turns into ravenous cannibals in more ways than one, possibly. So the centralized form of criminality is the most dangerous because it's the most industrial scale. If you want industrial scale mass murder, leave it to government. In an anarcho-tyranny situation, it's like a purge almost, where you have a little bit of everything. You have all aspects of criminality. That's kind of where we're in. We're in this peri-hybrid form of tyranny right now, where it's not quite dystopia, it's not quite Mad Max. And then, of course, you have Mad Max, which is, well, Mad Max. As for this hunting humans thing, the reason why I bring that up is, again, there's a certain level of criminality that I think we don't even see. Okay, we don't see the organized crime. We don't see this. We don't see the Epstein stuff. We hear about it, but we don't really understand how things work in that very dark underworld that typically involves some aspect of human trafficking or these, I guess it's not ritualistic killings, but it's just sadism. There's a movie with Ice-T, and it's called Surviving the Game. You should watch it, because I don't think it's too far from the truth. In fact, I think the whole premise has been replayed under other names. I mean, there's the Hunger Games. There's other movies that kind of depict this scenario where, people are, for lack of better terms, sacrificed and forced to fight one another for the amusement of the elites, essentially, or to show their loyalty. But this doesn't sit well with me, okay? Because in addition to human trafficking for SA, which is sexual assault, there's human trafficking for organs, there's human trafficking for a variety of other reasons. This story in particular is crazy. And where there's smoke, there's fire. So I just want to read this for you. Milan prosecutors have opened a murder investigation into claims that Italian citizens went on paid sniper safaris in Bosnia in the early 1990s. Allegations say wealthy foreigners, including Italians, paid large sums, up to 100,000 euros in today's terms, to shoot at civilians from Serb-held positions overlooking besieged Sarajevo. Now imagine what happens in African countries or Middle Eastern countries. I guarantee you it's much, much worse than what you're hearing about here. It's much, much worse. Journalist Ezio Gavazzini filed the complaint, citing a Bosnian military intelligence officer who says Bosnia informed Italian intelligence in 1994 and was later told Italy had stopped the safaris. Gavazzini's evidence includes witness testimony and a report by former Sarajevo mayor Benjamina Karic. That's crazy, the mayor, okay? Why would they lie about this? It inspired the 2022 documentary Sarajevo Safari. These people are amongst us. This is like American Psycho stuff. These people are amongst us. This is why I don't like trophy hunting. There's something really weird about trophy hunting, which will transition all too well into a purge-like SHTF situation, if you know what I mean. These people are out there and they exist. So what I'm trying to say is, we're not only dealing with people who are trying to meet their essential needs, or even their frivolous needs, shoes or television sets. That's low-hanging fruit. We're talking about very cunning, unscrupulous people who are sadists, psychopaths, sociopaths, and these are the people who rub shoulders in the upper echelons of government. These are the people who are going to be the ones who watch you and your family get conscripted to go and die in wars that they will profit from and likely be sitting on the sidelines enjoying themselves, sniping people as they flee from the front lines. And I think what happens to people is that when they start engaging in this kind of stuff, as is depicted in the movie American Psycho, they don't like themselves for doing it. It's like they probably have moments where they really look at what they're doing with disgust, but in order to medicate that, they keep doing it. It's like a drug, like you're disgusted with yourself because you use the drug, and so you're depressed, so you use more of the drug. And so it's something that it just gets worse and worse and worse. Anyways, trying to make sense of all this, put it all together for people to warn you that there's trouble coming, and security, being vigilant, keeping your head on a swivel is so important. A lot of people think that it's just going to be one-dimensional because, Hollywood has conditioned us. You sit by the door, you train your firearm on down the hallway, and the zombies will come through one by one. But you're going to be dealing with very cunning people who, if they're organized into gangs, if they already have good street smarts, and then you have on top of that, you have the bureaucrats to deal with, who they're training to round you up. These 300,000 people are basically being trained in order to be the administrators of whatever sort of conscription thing they're going to be rolling out. And so, it served them well for us to be a bunch of dainty, pampered little pussies for the longest time. But now, of course, when the war drums start beating, well, it's time to get people into shape so that we can send them off to the front line. I hope you guys learned something from this monologue, and just understand that what you're seeing happening right now is all a trial run. What you're seeing in Ukraine, you think you've been conditioned to believe that could never happen here because we're the land of the brave and the free. But maybe, just maybe, you're brainwashed. And maybe it's going to be a lot worse here. And the dehumanization that is going to happen will be astonishing to people. And what will be more astonishing is how little people will care and how easily the majority will acquiesce. That is the real scary part. Have a plan for security. Security, security, security. There really is safety in numbers when it comes to this stuff, whether it's centralized violence or decentralized. There's safety in numbers. There's a reason why when the Ukrainian commissionaires or the paramilitary scoop people off the streets, if there are a bunch of people who resist and fight, that they leave them alone. It's a path of least resistance. They don't want a coup. They don't want a civil war brewing in the country. They don't want Ukrainians to have any reason to resist the government and rock the boat or join the Russians, which could happen. In fact, I predicted that would happen a couple of years ago. Hasn't happened yet, but it very well could. This is why they have to tread very, very lightly. If you want to support this channel, go through the links in the description below. Gear up at CanadianPreparedness.com. There ain't much left, but get what you can while it's there. There still is a few goodies in there. I walk through the warehouse and I'm like, man, somebody's going to get that and is going to get a crazy 30% off deal. Get your freeze-dry wholesale foods. And Jace Medical now has their own medical kits that have been devised by Aaron Acey. And we're going to be releasing a video on the rationale for why that and how that kit was designed in the coming days ahead. But get your antibiotics. Okay, stock up on your medications. these prescription medications. They make it very easy to get, and these are going to be absolutely life-saving in a disaster. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care.